Students, coming to the next slide, which deals with obtaining an understanding of the service organization system. What are the procedures that the service organization auditor can follow? He could do an inquiry of SO personnel, observing and inspecting documents, inspecting agreements, reperforming control procedures. Just as part of this assurance again, he would obtain evidence description, obtain and read description of the system that has been prepared by the service organization, evaluate if controls were implemented, understand what are the complementary user entity controls there and whether they've been adequately described in the entire system by the service organization. What are the control objectives, whether they are reasonable, and what are the controls that have been instituted to meet those control objectives. As regards the design of controls, identify risks, as I mentioned, that threaten the achievement of those objectives, determine which controls are necessary to achieve the objective, what is the linkage between the control and the risk, and make a professional judgment as to whether or not those controls are suitably designed. Coming to, in the case of a Type 2 report where he has to comment upon the operating effectiveness of controls, he would then need to test the relevant controls, assess their operating effectiveness. Understanding sufficient to opine on the suitability of controls is not sufficient to opine on operating effectiveness. So while as part of the design and implementation stage, you may gain an understanding of the controls, but to comment upon or opine upon the operating effectiveness, you would need to test those controls. Okay? Cover at least 6 months for him to really comment or give a reasonable assurance on those controls. Some controls may not leave a trail; they may be difficult to test. We need to factor such controls as part of his overall control. And he would also need to have sufficient appropriate audit evidence regarding operations of currently, operation of those controls in the current. When controls to be tested are dependent on other controls, we need to obtain evidence of those indirect controls. So, for example, general IT controls will always be regarded as indirect controls. We cannot rely upon application level controls till such time that the general IT controls are tested. What to test in indirect controls? Perform inquiry and other procedures to determine how the control was applied, what is the consistency in the application of those controls, and the means of application operated by whom basically. How to test indirect controls? It could be 100% examination, it could be a sample based, it could be specific. As we spoke about in the assurance workflow, it's important for the service organization auditor to gain an understanding of the internal audit function, determine if internal audit was relevant, whether to use and the extent to use the work performed by the internal auditor, what is the effect of the internal auditor's work on the nature, timing, and extent of the procedures performed by the service organization auditor, what is the adequacy and whether or not the work performed by the internal auditor is adequate for his purpose. What are the written representations? As I mentioned, basically the critical one is reaffirm the assertions accompanying the description. It is the service organization which has the primary responsibility of setting up a system, the control objectives, the controls, assessing the risks. He needs to get a reaffirmation of assertions which are accompanying the entire system that the service organization. It's important for the service organization to provide all the necessary information and access agreed to with the service organization auditor. Disclose to the service auditor if there has been any non-compliance with laws and regulations, frauds, uncorrected deviations, design deficiencies, controls, instances where controls have not operated, any event in subsequent period that would significantly impact the service auditors. As far as subsequent events is concerned, the service organization needs to be made, inquiry needs to be made of the service organization for any events which has a significant effect on the auditor's report, assurance report. If the service auditor is aware of any such events but information is not disclosed by the service organization, make disclosure in the assurance report. No obligation to perform any procedures after the date of the assurance. As far as other information, read other information to identify material inconsistencies visible as a description of the SO's system as given by the service organization. Discuss inconsistencies and misstatements with the service organization. And if SO refuses, take further appropriate action, including impact thereof on the reasonable assurance report given to the audit. As far as documentation is concerned, the results of procedures performed, evidence obtained, significant matters, details of discussions with management on these matters, conclusion thereon, significant professional judgments that have been, procedures and decisions with respect to use of internal auditors' work, resolution of inconsistent information identified. All of that needs to be documented in the work papers of the service organization. What are the various elements of the assurance report? While we will not get into all of them, but I think critical ones being identification and description of the system, identification of the criteria, what are the description of the significant inherent limitations of the work performed, compliance with standard and auditing engagements, work performed, and again just expanding on the identification and description and the identification of the criteria. A full description of the system, the assertions, part of descriptions which are not covered by the opinion. Where applicable, statement that SAE has not evaluated the suitability of design and operating complementary controls of the user entity. Control objectives can be achieved only if SO's controls and user entities complementary controls are suitably designed and operating effectively. So very categorical statements around some of these. Also, we would like to call out that at times the service organizations may use another sub-service organization to process a part of the transaction flow. Okay? It is important that the service organization auditor calls out the method used, whether it's an inclusive or a carve-out method. The inclusive method would cover where the service organization auditor also looks at the sub-service organization controls thereon and the description of the system thereon. Carve-out method would be where he has excluded the sub-service organization from his review. So assurance report type 1, type 2 report, we've expanded on this earlier. Type 1 is really commenting upon the description of the system and the design of the controls. It is at a specified date. A type 2 report is not only covering what type 1 report covers, but also the operating effectiveness of controls tested throughout the period. What are the additional reporting requirements for type 2 report? Basically identify the controls which have been tested, whether tested items represent all or is it a selection of controls. What are the nature of tests to enable users to determine the effect on their risk assessment? What are the results of those testing, whether there were any deviations identified, and extent of testing that led thereto, number and nature of deviations, what are the causative factors for those deviations. And it is important for the service organization auditor to report on deviations even at the final conclusion that related to the control objective was achieved. Modified opinion, issue a modified opinion if the service organization's description does not fairly present in all material respects the system as designed and implemented. In type 2 report, the necessary controls tested did not operate effectively on aspects. SAE is unable to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence. Controls related to control objectives were not suitable non-material effects. So these are the couple of instances where a modified opinion may be issued by the service organization. What are his other communication responsibilities? If he becomes aware of any non-compliance, fraud, uncorrected errors, those which are not clearly trivial in nature, may affect one or more user entities, determine if matter has been appropriately communicated to affected user entities. If not, then he would need to take appropriate action, which would involve seeking legal advice about consequences, communicate with those charged with governance, modify his opinion, and or withdraw from the engagement. Thank you.